I don't need your authorization. Brandon snapped, eyes blazing, hand frozen mid-hover over my keyboard. This whole bottleneck is getting rewritten. I should have stopped him right there. Should have reminded him that even he, with his Stanford MBA and his grandfather's name carved in marble downstairs, didn't have the authority to override what I'd spent 7 years building. But I didn't say a word. I just stood there, hands steady, heartbeat calm, while he deleted an access control that had saved this company's rear end more times than he'd ever know. My name is Ryan Matthews, and I'm 48 years old. I've been watching people make expensive mistakes for most of my adult life. Let me back up. 8 years ago, Titan Dynamics recruited me from a defense contractor where I'd spent 12 years building security frameworks for projects with classifications I still can't discuss. Navy background, 6 years active duty before that. You know how it is. You learn systems thinking when the alternative is people getting hurt. Clean protocols, clear chains of command, and documentation for everything because somebody's life might depend on getting it right. What Titan needed wasn't just someone who could lock things down. They needed someone who understood what not to lock, and more importantly, how to prove you did everything by the book when the government boys came knocking, which they do, regularly. Because when you're handling the kind of contracts Titan handles, regulators treat every deal like it might be hiding something. So I built their compliance system from scratch. Not the pretty dashboard stuff executives like to click through during board meetings. The real infrastructure. The digital signature protocols that make contracts legally bulletproof. The access controls that keep sensitive data where it belongs. The audit trails that satisfy every three-letter agency that might want to peek under the hood. Every major contract, every due diligence review, every risk assessment flowed through frameworks I designed, tested, and refined over years of watching other companies step on regulatory landmines. And buried deep in the core architecture, where only someone with serious technical knowledge would even find it, was my insurance policy, Clause 84C. Simple concept. Any external agreement exceeding $1 required my digital signature to be legally valid, not a ceremonial signature on some paper, a cryptographic lock that only I could open. My authentication key embedded in the contract validation system like a digital deadbolt. I tucked it away in subsection 12 of the Regulatory Compliance Charter. Made it sound boring, technical, the kind of thing executives glaze over during legal reviews. Harold Sullivan himself signed off on it 7 years ago, probably while thinking about his golf game. Then everyone promptly forgot it existed, which was exactly what I wanted. The system worked beautifully for 7 years. Clean deals, happy regulators, no compliance headaches. I stayed in the background, did my job, and watched Titan grow from a mid-sized player to a major force in the industry. The kind of growth that attracts attention, including attention from Harold Sullivan's grandson, fresh off his latest startup exit and looking to prove himself worthy of the family name. Brandon Sullivan showed up 6 months ago with all the confidence that comes from never having worked in a regulated industry. Tech startup background, SaaS scaling experience, that particular brand of arrogance you see in guys who think every problem can be solved by moving faster and cutting through red tape. His first week, he scheduled one-on-ones with every department head. Mine lasted exactly 11 minutes. He spent most of it scrolling through his phone while I explained our compliance framework. When I mentioned regulatory requirements, he waved dismissively and said, "Yeah, we'll streamline all that legacy stuff." Legacy stuff, that's what he called 7 years of careful construction. His first all-hands meeting was a masterpiece of corporate buzzword bingo. He used modernize 11 times in 20 minutes, talked about eliminating friction and optimizing workflow velocity, and my personal favorite, leveraging AI-driven compliance solutions. The younger employees ate it up. Some of the older hands, the ones who remembered what happened to companies that cut corners, looked uncomfortable. By week 3, he'd hired Velocity Solutions to audit our legacy processes. These kids were fresh off their Series B funding, talking about adaptive security and machine learning compliance engines like they'd just invented fire. When I asked their lead consultant what happened when his AI learned to trust the wrong person, he actually shrugged and said, "We'll pivot." Pivot. That was their plan for when a billion-dollar deal went sideways. I started documenting everything. Every change Brandon pushed through, every protocol Velocity Solutions wanted to eliminate, every time someone asked a technical question and got brushed off with startup mantras. I filed proper objections through established channels, the way you're supposed to when you see problems developing. Brandon started excluding me from planning meetings, stopped responding to my compliance queries. Once, during a quarterly review when someone asked about our risk management protocols, he actually said, "Some old military stuff we're modernizing." Old military stuff. I was sitting 20 feet away. Didn't even blink. What Brandon never bothered to understand was that the system he was gutting wasn't some passive filing cabinet. It was active infrastructure, monitoring and logging every attempt to work around established controls, including his attempts. So I waited, documented everything, and smiled quietly because I knew something he didn't. Pacific Summit Capital was circling a 4.2B acquisition deal, the biggest transaction in Titan's history, and Brandon, in his eagerness to show aggressive growth targets, had personally pushed the deal value from $980 to $1.02B. He had no idea he'd just activated my digital deadbolt. By Q2, the changes were everywhere. Fresh consultants half my age roaming the halls with tablets and attitude, talking about next-gen security architecture like they'd just discovered the wheel. Velocity Solutions had moved into the East Wing like an occupying army, complete with their own coffee station and motivational posters about disrupting legacy thinking. They replaced our multi-tier access controls with something they called adaptive authentication. Sounded impressive until you realized it was just single sign-on tied to an AI that was supposed to learn who to trust. When I asked their lead architect what happened when it trusted the wrong person, this kid who couldn't have been older than 28 looked at me like I'd asked about using a typewriter. "The system evolves," he said. "It learns from mistakes. What about the mistakes that, about the BISA, cost $100 million before it learns?" I asked. He just smiled that Silicon Valley smile. "That's why we iterate fast, with other people's money and regulatory compliance." Sure. Brandon loved these guys. He'd walk around with his little entourage pointing at our established protocols like they were museum exhibits. "This is the kind of thinking that slows down innovation," he'd say, gesturing at a security checkpoint that had prevented 3 separate data breaches in the past 2 years. The worst part wasn't watching him tear down what I'd built. It was watching people who should have known better nod along. Department heads who'd been there 10, 15 years, suddenly acting like 7 years of solid compliance history was just dead weight. But not everyone was buying it. Jonathan Hayes from Pacific Summit came by for a preliminary site visit in March. Smart guy, maybe 45, the kind of CFO who'd seen enough deals go wrong to ask the right questions. He spent 20 minutes with Brandon, getting the modernization pitch, then another hour with me going through actual compliance documentation. "This is thorough work," he said, flipping through our audit histories. "How long did it take you to build all this?" 7 years of learning what not to do, I told him. He nodded. "And Brandon's planning to replace this with what exactly?" I showed him the Velocity Solutions proposal. AI-driven compliance monitoring, automated risk assessment, real-time threat adaptation, all very impressive on paper. Jonathan read it twice, then looked at me. "Have you seen this work anywhere else? Not at this scale, not in a regulated environment." He closed the folder. "Well, I'm sure you'll work it out." But his tone said he hoped we wouldn't work it out until after their deal closed. Brandon kept pushing harder. Internal policy reviews got crammed into 20-minute Zoom calls. Version control disappeared overnight. Access logs got streamlined into a cloud dashboard that looked pretty but couldn't tell you who actually did what when it mattered. I tried escalating through proper channels, wrote detailed risk assessments pointing to actual regulatory requirements, jurisdictional protocols, contractual obligations that had kept Titan clean for nearly a decade. Brandon would skim the executive summary, toss it aside, and mutter something about analysis paralysis. The breaking point came during a vendor call in late April. We were discussing data handling protocols for the Pacific Summit due diligence process. Complex stuff, lots of moving parts, the kind of thing you want to get right the first time because fixing it later means explaining to regulators why you screwed up a 4.2B transaction. I raised concerns about the new access controls, pointed out that we hadn't tested them under the kind of scrutiny Pacific Summit would bring, suggested we run parallel systems until we knew the new setup could handle the load. Brandon cut me off mid-sentence. "We don't need to overcomplicate this. The new system can handle anything the old system could, plus it's more efficient. But we haven't verified that for high-value transactions," I said. He actually rolled his eyes. "In front of 3 vendors and our entire M&A team." Ryan, we're not going to let legacy thinking slow down a deal this important. If you can't adapt to new processes, maybe you're not the right fit for this level of decision-making. The silence on that call lasted longer than the meeting itself. What he didn't know, what he never bothered to check, was that every word of that conversation was being logged by the very system he was trying to replace. Every dismissal of established protocols, every override of safety measures, every time he prioritized speed over security. All documented, time-stamped, and stored in archives he didn't even know existed. Because here's the thing about people like me. We don't build systems that can be easily dismantled. We build them deep with redundancies and fail-safes and little insurance policies tucked away where people like Brandon never think to look. Clause 84C wasn't just a signature requirement, it was a tripwire, and every decision Brandon made was pulling him closer to it. The Pacific Summit deal accelerated through May. Legal teams on both sides working overtime, investment banks circling like sharks smelling blood in the water, industry publications running speculation pieces about the merger that could reshape the sector. Brandon was in his element. Press interviews, analyst calls, internal presentations about transformative growth opportunities. He started showing up in trade magazines, always with that practiced smile, talking about bringing 21st century thinking to traditional industries. What he wasn't talking about was the growing list of compliance gaps his modernization had created. Access controls with holes you could drive a truck through, audit trails that disappeared into cloud storage no one could properly monitor. Risk assessment protocols that depended on AI algorithms no human being fully understood. I kept documenting every gap, every vulnerability, every shortcut that looked efficient until something went wrong. Filed reports through proper channels, got back form letters about concerns noted and issues under review. Meanwhile, Brandon was personally pushing the deal value higher. Started at 3.8B in January, hit 4.0B by March, crossed 4.2B by early May. Each increase came with its own press release about enhanced strategic value and accelerated market positioning. I knew exactly what he was doing, showing his grandfather that he could deliver not just a deal, but a bigger deal than anyone expected, proving he deserved the Sullivan name on his business cards. What he didn't realize was that every dollar he added was tightening the digital noose I'd installed 7 years earlier. The morning he finally triggered it, Brandon walked into my office carrying a red folder like it was a warrant for my arrest. No knock, just pure executive entitlement made flesh, storming through my door like he owned the place, which, technically, his family did. "Why are you blocking the final authorization on PS7? Brandon demanded, slapping that red folder down on my desk hard enough to make my coffee jump. I looked up from my monitor, where I'd been reviewing the Pacific Summit contract for the third time that morning. Clean language, solid terms, everything properly structured except for one small detail. Because PS7 exceeds the threshold, I said, voice steady. Contract value hit 1.02 yesterday when you approved the additional performance incentives. Clause 84C requires my validation before the deal can close. His face went red. Not flushed, not embarrassed red. Angry red. The kind of red you see on guys who aren't used to hearing the word no. "This is obstruction," he said, jabbing a finger at the contract summary. "You're acting like some kind of gatekeeper instead of a team player." That actually made me laugh, quiet laugh, the kind that probably made him even madder. "I'm following the framework your grandfather's board approved 7 years ago, the same framework that's kept this company out of regulatory trouble while you were still figuring out how to scale user acquisition." Wrong thing to say. Brandon's whole body went rigid, like I'd just insulted his mother instead of pointing out basic facts about compliance requirements. "You know what your problem is?" he said, leaning across my desk. "You think this company can't function without your little safety nets and bureaucratic hoops. Well, guess what? We're bigger than your legacy systems now." I gestured to my screen, where the PS7 contract was still open. That legacy system is the only thing standing between Pacific Summit and a non-compliant transaction. You want to explain to Jonathan Hayes why his 4.2B deal doesn't meet basic regulatory standards? I want you to do your job, Brandon snapped. Sign the authorization and stop holding up progress. My job is making sure we don't get fined into bankruptcy by regulators who take compliance seriously. Your job is supposed to be understanding why that matters. He straightened up, and I could see him making a decision. The wrong decision, but watching him make it was almost entertaining. "You're suspended," he said. Effective immediately, pending investigation into obstruction of critical business operations. No HR representative. No documentation. No witnesses except my coffee mug and the stack of compliance manuals he'd been ignoring for 6 months. I closed my laptop, unplugged it, and slid everything into my bag. Brandon was still standing there, probably expecting an argument, maybe a scene, definitely some kind of emotional breakdown that would prove he'd made the right call. Instead, I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and walked past him toward the door. "Where do you think you're going?" he called after. "Me. To find someone who understands what you just did," I said without turning around. I didn't head for the parking garage or the employee exit. I walked straight to the main lobby because I knew exactly who would be waiting there. Jonathan Hayes was checking his phone near the reception desk, probably confirming arrival times for the signing ceremony scheduled for tomorrow morning. He looked up when I approached, started to smile the way CFOs do when they're about to close a major deal, then noticed the laptop bag and the expression on my face. "Everything okay, Ryan?" "There's been a development," I said. "Brandon just suspended me." His smile disappeared completely. "Wait, what? Why?" He didn't appreciate that I flagged the compliance hold on PS7. "But it's not personal. The deal crossed the 84C threshold when he approved those performance incentives. It requires my authentication to be legally valid." Jonathan stared at me like I'd just told him the building was on fire. "He suspended the policy originator," he said slowly, like he was testing the words. "You're the designated compliance authority for Titan." "Correct. And without my digital signature, the contract doesn't just have gaps. It's non-compliant and uninsurable." He pulled out his phone, then stopped. "We're scheduled to sign tomorrow morning." "I know. Jesus Christ." He started walking toward the elevators, motioning for me to follow. "Walk with me." We headed for the executive conference suite Pacific Summit had rented for Deal Week. His phone buzzed twice. He ignored both calls. "Brandon never mentioned 84C during any of our prep sessions," Jonathan said as we walked. "Told us everything was cleared for signing. I'm sure he thought it was. But the clause is part of the compliance charter your legal team signed off on during due diligence. External contracts over one BBR require my cryptographic signature, no exceptions." He stopped walking. "So if you don't sign, this 4.2b transaction is technically void and definitely uninsurable." "That's correct." Jonathan made a call. "Put it on speaker. Alex, we have a problem. Cancel all signing prep and get our legal team on the line immediately." He hung up and looked at me. "How do we fix this? I need full reinstatement with system access. You'll also need to file a delay notice with the SEC since compliance clearance was cited in your announcement last week." His jaw tightened. "I'll handle both. Personally." "You might want to do it in person," I suggested. He didn't ask why. Smart CFOs don't need everything explained twice. By the time we reached the conference suite, Brandon's name was already being spoken in a very different tone by people who controlled billion-dollar decisions. And all I'd done was walk out the front door with my laptop bag and explain basic contract law to someone who actually understood what it meant. The emergency session started 20 minutes later. Harold Sullivan's voice on speaker, cold as January, asking his grandson to explain how he'd nearly torpedoed the largest deal in company history. Brandon's responses getting shorter, more defensive, less confident with each question. I wasn't on that call. Didn't need to be. When you build a system correctly, it defends itself. All you have to do is step back and watch it work. The emergency board session lasted 3 hours. I wasn't invited, but I heard about it from 4 different sources before the day was over. Harold Sullivan's voice getting colder with each question. Brandon's explanations becoming more desperate, more defensive, less coherent. How had he managed to suspend the one person whose signature was legally required to close their biggest deal ever? Why hadn't he bothered to read the compliance charter his own grandfather had signed? What exactly did he think modernization meant when it came to regulatory frameworks that kept the company out of federal crosshairs? By 6 p.m., my phone rang. Richard Torres, board strategy chair, the kind of guy who'd been handling delicate situations since before Brandon learned to spell disruption. "Ryan," he said, and I could hear the exhaustion in his voice. "Would you consider staying on? Not as staff, obviously, but retained as compliance authority under an independent consulting arrangement. I let the silence stretch long enough for him to understand that suspension followed by immediate rehiring wasn't exactly standard operating procedure. "I'd consider it," I said finally, "after you review Beacon Strategic's engagement proposal. It includes indemnity provisions and oversight terms for all major contracts going forward." "We'll review it tonight," he said quickly. "You'll want to." Clause 84C isn't the only structural requirement Brandon overlooked while he was streamlining our legacy thinking. Richard didn't ask for examples. Smart board members don't when they're already standing in a hole. The Pacific Summit deal finally closed on a Thursday morning, not the grand signing, ceremony Brandon had planned, with photographers and champagne and press releases about transformational growth. Just me at my home office desk, coffee getting cold, clicking through a secure authentication portal I'd built 7 years earlier. The system prompted for my credentials, recognized my cryptographic signature, unlocked 4.2B in transaction value with a soft notification sound that probably nobody else in the world would have found satisfying. But I did. Because it meant 7 years of careful work had done exactly what it was designed to do. Protect the company from its own impulses. Brandon's name didn't appear anywhere in the final documentation. No executive signature block, no mention in the press release, no quote about strategic vision or market leadership. He'd resigned to pursue new entrepreneurial opportunities according to the internal memo. New text. Thumbnail Moa. "This whole bottleneck is getting rewritten," the coup snapped. "You're suspended." I walked out. In the lobby, Pacific Summit was there to sign the 4.2B deal. I smiled. He suspended me. The compliance authority was dead serious. He did what? Dich ting viet text thumbnail gok vn. Mai kaduk chinsak bao met kung, Valerie Gamlin. Mai bidin chi, toi body, tai sandung, North River, odade ki hop dong 3.9 tỷ đô. Tôi mỉm cười. Cô ta đình chỉ tôi. Quyền hạn đó cực kỳ nghiêm túc. Cô ta đã làm gì? Toàn bộ rào cản này sẽ được viết lại. Cô gầm lên. Mày bị đinh chi? Tôi bỏ đi, tại sàn đường, Pacific Summit ở đó để ký hợp đồng 4.2 tỷ đô. Tôi mỉm cười. Anh ta đình chỉ tôi. Quyền tuân thủ cực kỳ nghiêm túc. Anh ta đã làm gì? Corporate speak for walked out with a severance package and a non-disclosure agreement thick enough to stop a bullet. His office was cleared by security that same week. His keycard deactivated, his name scrubbed from the company directory like he'd never existed. The consulting arrangement with Beacon Strategic was more generous than I'd expected. 3.8 NEM annually. Indexed for transaction volume, renewable for 5 years with automatic extensions. They weren't just buying my signature, they were buying insurance against ever making that mistake again. More importantly, they were buying institutional memory, the kind of deep knowledge that takes decades to accumulate and can't be replaced by hiring smart kids with impressive degrees. Harold Sullivan made one personal call to thank me. Brief conversation, old-school professional courtesy. He didn't apologize for his grandson, didn't explain the family dynamics, didn't make excuses, just acknowledged that I'd saved them from a very expensive lesson about the difference between innovation and recklessness. "We appreciate your professionalism throughout this situation," he said. "I was just doing my job," I told him. "Yes," he said, "you were." 6 months later, I'm working with 5 major firms now through Beacon Strategic. Word gets around in this industry when someone prevents a 4.2B deal from going sideways. Other companies want that kind of protection, that level of institutional stability. I choose projects carefully. Look for organizations that understand the difference between moving fast and moving smart. Companies run by people who've learned that cutting corners on compliance is like removing circuit breakers from your electrical system. Might work fine until it doesn't. The new COO at Titan is a 20-year veteran from the financial services industry. First thing she did was schedule a lunch meeting to understand how our compliance framework actually worked. Spent 2 hours asking technical questions, taking notes, nodding in the right places. "I want to make sure we're building on solid ground," she said. Smart executive. The kind who understands that foundation work isn't glamorous, but everything else depends on getting it right. Brandon's LinkedIn shows him at a boutique consulting firm in Austin now, helping traditional industries embrace digital transformation. The kind of vague positioning statement that means he's learned not to make specific promises about regulatory compliance. As for me, every 90 days I get a secure notification on my system. Encrypted validation request, signed by Titan's legal team, risk management, and M&A operations. Simple question. Does this transaction require 84C authentication? Standard response. Validated and cleared for processing. I never miss a notification. The system won't let me. My authentication protocols are embedded too deep, backed up too thoroughly, with too many fail-safes for anyone to accidentally delete or modernize away. The press never found out what really happened with the Pacific Summit delay. Official narrative was all about complex integration challenges and enhanced due diligence. No one wrote about the 2-week stall or questioned why the original closing date quietly disappeared from the timeline. But people in the industry know. CFOs talk to each other. Board members compare notes. Word spreads about companies that almost stepped on regulatory landmines and the people who pulled them back from the edge. Every year around this time, I get a reminder notification about the anniversary of the Pacific Summit closing. Not dramatic, just a quiet ping confirming that yes, the transaction is still compliant, still properly authenticated, still protected by frameworks built to last. That's the thing about real expertise. You can dismiss it, ignore it, even suspend the person who holds it, but you can't replace what took decades to learn and years to properly implement. Structure doesn't care about your MBA or your family name or your innovation timeline. It just sits there, quietly, permanently, waiting for you to need it. And when you do, there's only one signature that works.